because it meant that Washington was actually both more knowledgeable and wiser than Mr. Dershowitz gives him credit for. He, on the one hand, recognizes, if you understand, I believe, the meaning of that phrase, the possibility that there are going to be good people who don't acknowledge the existence of God and who are not good by virtue of religion. That's why he says you indulge it with caution. He doesn't say don't indulge it. He says indulge it with caution. But what does caution imply? Well, caution implies that you're indulging something that's dangerous and that you move down a road that could lead to destructive possibilities. So you put on a yellow light because you want to avoid that destruction. In that regard, I think Washington had a great deal of respect for the truth because he understood that the point of statesmanship is not to win debates. It's to try to guide nations down paths that will actually avoid for them the worst consequences. And I think that's the question we actually face here. And we can't trivialize it by pretending that anybody suggests that this or that interpretation of religion ought to be imposed by force on anybody and so forth and so on. Furthest thing from my mind and the mind of any reasonable, decent Americans, which we all understand. However we disagree about the First Amendment, one thing we know is it doesn't allow that. And that is not in question here. But what is in question is whether or not we understand the distinction that I think has to be made between what is possible for human beings and what is possible for societies. It's something that I think has been recognized both by philosophers and by religious thinkers, because the aim of our human life as individuals goes rather beyond that of our life as social beings. To put it in old terminology, the aim of our life as social beings is justice, but justice is not the ultimate good for the individual. Indeed, according to my religious faith as a Christian, I actually get something besides justice from God. If God was going to be just to me, I would be punished. Alan Dershowitz says, well, God shouldn't punish you just because you come to the conclusion that you don't believe in him and so forth and so on. Well, the truth of the matter is, according to the Bible, we all have merited punishment anyway. And we don't escape it by our own merits. That's not the point. The point is we escape it because God is merciful, and he doesn't punish us because he has offered us, without our having to get involved in it, a way to salvation. And salvation is actually a greater good than justice. But it's a greater good that I think we recognize rightly in this society is to be pursued by individuals according to their conscience, and that they must be respected in their freedom to seek out that path which will lead them to salvation. To think it through, to pray over it, to meditate over it, to open their hearts to it, and to follow that path which results from that, and from what I believe is in the end the grace of God in their lives. But all of that can't be done by force, and nobody suggests that it should be. None of it can be imposed. Can't force somebody to be saved. See? And so it's never even a question. We caricature things that haven't even been suggested, and then we pretend we've said something. There is a greater challenge, though. There is a greater challenge, though. See, because I don't think the founders were as narrow-minded and silly as some people want to imply. That's why Washington's phrase was quite weighty and complex. And Mr. Dershowitz's characterization of that phrase reduced it to a caricature. One of the most complex figures in our founding was probably Thomas Jefferson. Lots of people say he didn't believe in God. He sure tolerated the mention of his name a lot for a guy who didn't believe in him. But I would actually like to say, though, that if he didn't believe in him, that's a stronger case than anything as to why we need to take a second look at the American Declaration of Independence and the acquiescence of Jefferson and some others like him in the reference to the Creator there. Let us assume for the moment that all the Jefferson is atheist people are correct. See? If Jefferson didn't acquiesce in the reference to the Creator because he thought it was true, maybe he did it because he thought it was necessary. See? Necessary for what? Necessary in order to complete the argument that constrains human power. Necessary in order to establish a ground so that the weak and the defenseless, so that those with no power, those with no eloquence, those with no case to be made by their money or their status or anything else about them, would be able to stand in the face of every human power whatsoever and demand respect for their human rights and dignity. Do we think that that comes about? Do we think that that comes about because Alan Dershowitz feels like it today or Alan Keyes feels like it today? No. The challenge of human history has been to come up with a principle of justice so couched that the powers that so often have claimed to be the substance of justice must nonetheless be bound by it, and so that those who have been docilely subject to those powers in the many centuries of human abuse would never again believe it was right, even when they did not have the power to stand for the time being against those who oppressed them. Okay? How do you get there? How do you get there? See, because the argument down through human history has been, quite frankly, that might makes right. And sure, philosophers in their closet have come up with other things. They do it all the time. But philosophers in the closet don't govern nations. Philosophers in the closet don't move human heart and shape human conscience and characteristics directly. That has to be done by other agencies, and sadly, those agencies down through the years have been unconstrained in so many instances by elements of conscience, except where they were produced by incidental things. You are my brethren in this, in that, in biology, in tribe, in ethnicity, in war, and so I will not abuse my power against you. But what about those beings left out of the purview of those definitions of community, who have nothing to recommend them in their dignity except the bare humanity that they can claim? Why respect them? Down through the ages, power hasn't had much respect for them at all. And as I said to a young lady in a class today, the challenge of all of this, you see, is not just to shape the ordinary consciences or the good consciences, no. How do we get the folks who would otherwise be tempted to abuse their superiority to listen? And how do we get those who would otherwise be tempted simply to submit to their abuse to have the courage to oppose them? And that's where I think the founders had somewhat greater wisdom than the people who reduced their views to a caricature. They were faced with a real problem, and they wanted a solution that had some chance of being translated into a relatively lasting reality. And they understood one principle, a little bit cynical perhaps, but nonetheless verified by much of human history, that power ultimately only respects a greater power. Isn't that sad? Power cannot be relied upon to respect greater wisdom. That's why Plato, though he would have loved it to have philosophers kings, understood that they probably wouldn't end up that way. Oh, no, power doesn't necessarily respect greater wisdom. It doesn't necessarily respect greater holiness. It doesn't necessarily respect all these things. Sometimes it does, you know. Sometimes the Pope will come out of Rome and talk Attila out of sacking the place or whatever, but a lot of times it won't work. And people die and they're raped and whole civilizations are destroyed, so that the smoking ruins left behind are today called deserts. That's what the Mongols did in great parts of the world. So power doesn't necessarily respect this, except to say, how can you come up with something that might be a little more reliable than that? I think the aim of the founders was at least to invoke a paradigm that offered a surer foundation for our appeals to conscience. For what better logic to face power with than the notion that whatever power you have, I gain my dignity from the absolute greatest power of all. The one that you can't touch, the one that you cannot equal, the one before which every human power pales by comparison. And because I can claim my dignity by virtue of that greater power, even on the day you defeat me, even on the day that you put your foot upon my neck and trample me into the dust, I still live in the hope that my justice will rise, because you cannot defeat his will. That is not what I have just articulated, not the statement of some abstract hope that would give comfort to philosophers as they read their books. Now, what I have just stated is the kind of thing that when you stand before a nation threatened by oppression will move the hearts of people in that nation to lay down their very lives for the sake of its liberty. And I do not speak here of something that has not happened. Every time we have gone to war, every time we have called upon the men and women of this nation to face the ultimate sacrifice, we have not engaged in a cost-benefit analysis, telling them what wondrous things would be found in their garage when they got home. Because we know it doesn't work to send people off to war and death to talk to them about the things that they know they may not enjoy. We talked to them of the great ideals and the great values. We prayed over them, and finally we invoked for them their role in that eternal plan of good and justice, which involved the preservation of this nation on behalf of liberty. Maybe we only honored these things in the breach, but I do know that many people fought and died for them in the Civil War, in the Great World Wars, in breaches around the world, because their hearts were sustained by the belief that they stood in their fight for justice in the grace of Almighty God. We forget, don't we, when we talk of the civil rights movement and all of these things, you think it was an accident that Martin Luther King was a preacher? Because I know it was not. If we mean to have the courage to defend our liberty, then I believe we must preserve our reliance upon that appeal which lies beyond the reach of human power and which therefore cannot be defeated in hope, even when it is defeated in battle.
Mr. Dershowitz, I mean no disrespect when I say that that rhetorical marvel of a speech could have been made by the Ayatollah Khomeini. There would be very little difference. He would be invoking Islamic rhetoric. He would be talking about the great needs of Islam. He would be talking about how when our young people go to war and kill Iraqis or kill Jews, they're doing it in the name of Allah. It is precisely that rhetoric which scares me. It is brilliant. It is evocative. He got you to cheer and clap in the name of God. Ambassador Keyes is a good man, and he invokes God in the good cause. But throughout history, God has been as often invoked in the name of evil as in the name of good. Let me go back to the initial correction. I was not quoting George Washington. I was quoting Joseph Lieberman from the New York Times. I know you have doubts about the New York Times, but let me read you. This is what the Times said. He said, quote, George Washington warned us never to indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Your quarrel is with Joseph Lieberman. Your quarrel is with those who misconstrue and misunderstand. You know, the Founding Fathers were ordinary human beings. They included racism and sexism and slavery in the Constitution. They spoke about self-evident rights. If they're so self-evident, why didn't the British agree? Why did we have to fight a revolution? Rights are not self-evident. They're not unalienable. They are subject to modification just like anything else. I feel that Dr. Keyes has insulted so many good and decent people who have stood up against tyranny, whether it be Mordechai Analevich, who stood in the Warsaw Ghetto and gave his life to trying to defeat Nazism and who was a rampant and avid atheist, or whether it was the people at Tiananmen Square. We don't know their religious views. Some may have been Christians, some may have been Shintoists and Buddhists, some may have been atheists. It insults good and decent people to suggest that the cause of human rights somehow is associated or identified with a religion. History belies that. Human rights has stood up primarily against religion. We hear a lot about the glories of religion. Dr. Keyes, talk to us about the Inquisition. Talk to us about the Crusades. Organized religion is always having to say you're sorry for misunderstanding God's will in the past. That has been the history of organized religion. We're sorry for the Crusades. We're sorry that we slaughtered babies and children in the name of Jesus. We're sorry for the Inquisition. We're sorry for the pogroms. We were wrong then. God didn't speak to us clearly then, but he speaks to us clearly today when we make statements from the pulpit which cause rage against homosexuals And when Baptists tell us that women must submit gracefully to the will of their husbands, they're going to say they're sorry about that. Believe me, they're going to say they're sorry about that in years to come.